Let's go ahead and be turning to Matthew chapter 9. That's where we're going to get our text from this morning. And I love this title for this particular pericope in our scriptures. The title is A More Glorious Ministry. Jesus came to establish a much more glorious ministry than the one that existed at the time that he came to dwell amongst men. At that time, they were under the Mosaic law, under the Jewish law, and that Jewish law was very harsh, very exclusive, and Jesus came to bring a much more glorious ministry that freed all people from that old law, and that's what we're going to take a look at today, a more glorious ministry. We're looking at the last set of 3 miracles, the end of Matthew chapter 9, and really the miracle stories are all kind of self-explanatory. There's a little bit of a difference in this last set of 3 miracles, and I don't know if Matthew did this to kind of heighten the story, but there's 3 miracles that we look at, but each miracle is doubled. Each miracle includes 2 people. And so I think that's kind of interesting, just a small detail. But if you start glancing through the text, Matthew 9:18 and on, we're going to see a miracle where a woman is healed of hemorrhaging and a girl gets resurrected from the dead. We're going to see that 2 blind men are healed. And we're going to see that one man that has both a demon and is mute has both of those things healed. So it's interesting to me, both on all 3 miracle accounts, they're double. There's 2 of something happening. And here's just a minor little detail, guys. Maybe it's just a thing that a preacher catches on to. Matthew doesn't tell us this, but Matthew's going to tell us that the woman that gets healed was suffering from a hemorrhage of blood for 12 years. And then we're also going to see a young daughter that was 12 years old gets resurrected. I think that's kind of an interesting detail, but don't know what to make too much of that. So let's start with our scripture. We'll look at verse 18. Verse 18, and while he was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in and knelt before him, saying, my daughter has just died. But come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him, touched the fringe of his garment, for she said to herself, if I only touch his garment, I will be made well. And Jesus turned and seeing her, he said, take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well. And instantly the woman was made well. Verse 23, and when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, go away, for the girl is not dead, but she is sleeping. And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and he took her by the hand, and the little girl rose. In the larger context of Matthew's gospel, we've looked at the fact that Jesus came to take out the spiritual leaders that were leading at that day. We've already done sermons on how they were not shepherding correctly. They were not instructing the people correctly. And so God had promised in Malachi, one day I'll come get them out of the way. I myself will come and shepherd my people. And so Jesus is God incarnate, God in the flesh, who came to dwell amongst the people to show them a new and better way. And the scripture calls Jesus' ministry a much more glorious ministry than the previous one. What we're going to see here is that the efficacy of Jesus' ministry is for everybody, any nationality, any sex, any social strata in life. Jesus appeals to everybody, but the previous ministry was exclusive. And we're going to see that. I think that's what we see in this very first miracle story of the young girl and the woman. This change in the ministry, let me just go back and read this to you. 2 Corinthians 3:9. For if the ministry of condemnation was glorious, how much more glorious is the ministry of righteousness? Indeed, what was once glorious has no glory now in comparison to the glory that surpasses it. Just a little refresher on what's being said there, guys. Before Christ came, the Mosaic law is what was in place. The Mosaic law, what we call the Old Testament, and that's what the Jews were following. But that idea of Mosaic law was condemning. It was very hard on people. And in one place here, he says it was the ministry of condemnation because at any point that someone failed, they were condemned under that old law. So Jesus came to do away with that old law by dying on the cross, and his blood paid for the sins of mankind. So now mankind has been justified. Mankind has been made right with God, and there is no more condemnation for those that are in Christ Jesus. So Christ came to start a new ministry that replaces that old one. But when we look at Matthew's gospel, that's still the time of the old ministry. And so we're seeing Matthew record what Jesus does to help the audience realize, oh, Jesus is doing away with the old ministry, and he's bringing something brand new into existence. There's a disparity in the little miracle story that I just read to you, and I'd like to point this out because aside from the miracle, I think this is really what our attention is being drawn to. If you look at verse 18, it says that while he was saying these things to them, behold, a ruler came in. I would like you to put a square around the word a ruler and compare that to the next verse in verse 20. It says, and behold, a woman who was suffering from a discharge of blood came in. I would put a square around the word a woman there, because that is the contrast that I believe Matthew wants to see. Two people came to Jesus. One of them was this ruler, and one of them was a woman. And let's take our mind back 2,000 years to the time of Christ. And if we're familiar with antiquities, if we're familiar with the old ancient times, women didn't have a very prominent place in society. And so there's a contrast that's being highlighted for us here in how does Jesus deal with people that under that old ministry, under that old law, a wealthy, influential, affluent man was going to be at the top rung of society. But here you have a woman who, in those antiquated times, would have been way less esteemed, way at the bottom rung of society. And in Jewish law, she would have even been neglected and not counted as important. I'm sharing with you that ancient view of things because this is an ancient document. But what's interesting is how Jesus treats both of these people exactly the same. That's not surprising to us in our culture because we've evolved into a much better place. But 2,000 years ago, that would have been something that was unheard of. So I would kind of draw a square around those two ideas and realize that there is a contrast that Luke is painting for us to show us that the new ministry that Christ has is way more glorious than the old ministry. In this comparison and contrast, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the Jews liked comparing things in their stories that were exact opposites. A lot of times they'll compare love with hate. They'll compare heaven with earth. They'll compare what's clean with what's unclean. I don't know what that's all about, but their language deals a lot with painting huge contrasting things so that their conversation is much more interesting. There is those with the law and there's those without the law. And one of those contrasts would have been what we're looking at, a wealthy, influential man and a woman of a low position in society. This word that's given us, that's translated ruler, the wealthy, influential man, it gets translated ruler there. The word is archon. Archon is what gets translated as ruler, but archon has to do with the idea of a person that has great influence and a person that has great authority. So in a patriarchal society, this influential man with influence and authority was at the top rung of society, and this woman would have been at the complete opposite end of the spectrum. And just to help us kind of also understand what a contrast we have here between this man and this woman, to add to her low place in society, the scripture says that she had been bleeding for 12 years. In a terrible situation. And so if you think for a moment, well, how does it get any worse? How could you make the story any more dramatic than comparing this man and this woman? How could you add any more drama to that? And we may not realize it today, but you add even more drama by saying not only was she a woman, but she was ceremonially unclean. In the Old Testament, and let me take you back and let's just look at some of this. Leviticus chapter 15 and verse 19, when a woman was on her menstrual cycle, she was considered unclean and impure under the old ministry. That's why it was called that, what did I just call it? That's why it was called the ministry of condemnation. Under Jewish law, she would have been unclean. No one could go near her. No one could touch her. And everything she touches also becomes unclean. And that helps us get into the mind of the story. And not only did this lady have a difficult place in society, but she was viewed as unclean and untouchable because of this hemorrhage that couldn't be stopped. Let me read you the rules under Jewish law for someone that was like this, and it might help us have a tremendous amount of compassion for this woman. Leviticus 15 and verse 19, when a woman has a discharge, and the discharge in her body is blood, she shall be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her will be unclean. Verse 20, and everything on which she lies during her menstrual impurity, it shall be unclean, and everything also on which she sits shall be unclean, and whoever touches her bed, he shall be unclean. Verse 22, whoever touches anything on which she sits shall be unclean. I can't imagine how depressing that must have been for her. 12 years. Nobody wanting to follow near, no one wanting to touch anything she touches, no one wanting to touch her. Everything she does is unclean, and she can't get rid of this hemorrhage. And so for 12 years solid, she's almost like one of the lepers, cast out, left out. And I think that that's an important part of the story today, that in that society, in that day and age, she would have been cast out just like a leper. But what we're seeing is Jesus is bringing in a new ministry. Jesus does not distinguish between her and this influential, affluent man. Jesus is teaching the people that it's time to bridge this gap by distinguishing or segregating by race, by nationality, by sex, or by social status or any kind of a caste system. Jesus was tearing that down. and saying that the purpose of the gospel is efficacious for everybody. The purpose of the gospel is the same for everybody, and that there should never be any favoritism shown. The scribes and the Pharisees would have loved the influential man, the archon, the guy of high status, but the scribes and the Pharisees of that day would have rejected this woman and treated her like an outsider. But Jesus didn't do that, because Jesus came to usher in a new and a more glorious ministry. James, the brother of Jesus, will go on to teach the exact same thing. Can you imagine how much time it's going to take for this antiquated culture to embrace a new philosophy of accepting everybody as being equal? Let me read it to you. James chapter 2 will say the same thing. Chapter 2 and verse 1, "My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothes comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothes also comes in," verse 3, "and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, 'You sit here in a good place,' but you say to the poor man, 'Hey, you stand over there,' or 'Sit down at my feet,' have you not then made distinctions amongst yourself and become judges with evil thoughts?" That's the first lesson in this first miracle set. Jesus came to do away with judgment. Jesus came to do away with distinctions because of social class, because of sex, because of nationality. Not an easy thing to do in that time. The second miracle story, we pick it up back in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 27. "As Jesus passed on from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying aloud, 'Have mercy on us, Son of David.' And when he entered the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus said to them, 'Do you believe that I am able to do this?' And they said to him, 'Yes, Lord.' Then he touched their eyes. Even the blind men can see the King. Even the blind man can recognize Jesus for who he is, the fulfillment of prophecy that said that one day God would send a king like David to rule the people. That's a very special saying, because when God says, one day I'm going to send a king like David, what made King David such a unique king? Do you remember David's job before he became king? David was a shepherd. It was David's job to go out into the dangerous wilderness, and it was his job to protect sheep. As a young man, he was used to going out, and his love, his heart's desire was this sea of sheep before him, and he developed a heart where if he saw one of his sheep limping, he would want to go take care of that sheep. If he saw one of his sheep beginning to stray from the fold, his heart would go out and he would go leave the fold and go find that one stray sheep. And so God wanted a king that had the heart of a shepherd, a king that would love his citizens, a king that would have empathy for his citizens. And after David passed away, God says, one day I'm going to send you another king like David. This king will have empathy for his citizens. This king is Jesus, of course, and he will treat everybody the same. No matter who you are, if he sees someone wounded, he will go bind you up. No matter who you are, if he sees you straying from the flock, he will go out and find you and bring you home. And so these two, I think this is another play on the miracle here, but two blind men are the ones that can actually see Jesus. The third miracle story, verse 32. And as they were going away, behold, a demon-oppressed man who was mute was brought to him. And when the demon had been cast out, the mute man spoke. It's no surprise that Jesus cast out the demon, that he could heal this man. This is going to be our last miracle in this set of 9 miracles. But Jesus came to bring joy and rejoicing to Galilee. That's what his miracle stories are about. But what I think is most interesting here is the crowds that were witnessing his miracles. Finally, Matthew tells us what the crowds were thinking. In our very next verse here, Matthew 9:33, and the crowds marveled, saying, never has anything like this been seen in Israel. God had a purpose, and it was to make himself known to his people. But when a true God, when a real God, when a living God shows up, people see things that they've never ever seen before. And I think that that's a beautiful witness, a beautiful testimony to us that the God that we serve, being a real God, really has the opportunity to really make things happen. And he shows this to the audience to prove that Jesus is not a normal man. Jesus is not just a prophet, but he is divine. He is God in the flesh. Truly, this is Emmanuel, God with us. And if you remember when Jesus spoke in the temple, the people said he spoke as one that had authority. We've never heard anybody speak like this guy. And here the new witnesses, we've never seen anybody do what this guy does. Now, for our Old Testament scholars, some of this language should sound familiar. Someone doing something so impressive that it could only be God that was behind it. It could only be God that was revealing himself. And the reality is when God reveals himself, the people say, we've never seen anything like this in Israel. Let me take you back to Deuteronomy 4, where this exact same scenario has already played out before. God goes into Egypt and rescues Israel from slavery in Egypt. We'll remember that Moses did the 12 signs to Pharaoh in order to let the people be released. And then after they're released and they're in the wilderness, Moses reminds the people, don't forget what you saw God do. Because only a real living God could do what you saw happen in Egypt. Let me take you to it. Deuteronomy 4 and verse 32. For ask now of the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth, and ask from one end of heaven to the other whether such a great thing has ever happened or was ever heard of. Did any people ever hear the voice of a God speaking out of the midst of fire the way you have heard and still live? Has any God ever attempted to go take a nation from himself from the midst of another nation? By trials, by signs, by wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great deeds of terror, all of which the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes. And so he reminds the Israelites as they're in the wilderness, verse 35, to you it was shown so that you might know that the Lord is God and there is no other beside him. God let you witness these amazing miracles, these amazing feats. Have you ever heard of one of the Greek gods ever showing up in a nation to take a nation out of that nation for himself? Have you ever seen another God speak to his people through a mountain that was burning with fire? Are there any other gods that get boasted of in the world that can do that? And he says, God did this and let you see it so that you would know that there is no other God like the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of creation. So you were able to see this so that you could know for sure. And I want to tie that with John 20 because I think John borrows from this very text. And John's gospel is very unique. John's gospel shows us a lot of the miracles that Jesus did. And at the end of the gospel, around chapter 20, he says, here is why I showed you all of these miracles. Here is why I'm retelling the story of all the miracles that Jesus did. And it sounds just like what we just read. So John 20 and verse 30, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and so that by believing you can have life in his name. You notice there's also a shift in John's gospel. John wrote his gospel around 90 AD. That was after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD by Rome. Notice by the time that John writes his gospels, you don't see miracles being performed anymore. How do you know that? Because look at what he says here. I've written these down. I can't show them to you anymore. We don't see them anymore. But I've written down the things Jesus did so that when you read this, you can believe that Jesus was the Son of God. We get our testimony today by reading about the things that Jesus did back then. That's why I wrote them in this book, so that you could read them. Well, I think if we put ourselves in the woman's shoes that had been bleeding for 13 years and she's healed, if we put ourselves in the rich, young, affluent man's shoes who had a daughter that was dead and he gets his daughter back, if we put ourselves in the shoes of the two blind men that got their sight back, if we put ourselves in the shoes of the demon-possessed man that could now speak, we'll recognize that this was a time of joy, a time of rejoicing. All the people in Israel saying, we've never ever seen anything like this happen. This was a time of joy and rejoicing. That's another part of the story that Matthew wants to convey. But amongst the joy and the happiness and the rejoicing that Galilee was experiencing, we're also familiar with Matthew, and we must be thinking to ourselves, yeah, but there's an antithesis in the story somewhere. The story has been real happy and wonderful and exciting, but there's where is the fly in the soup? Where is the part of the story that's unfortunate? And that part is the very last verse that Matthew gives us in the account of the miracles. Here's the fly in the ointment, Matthew 9 and verse 34. But the Pharisees said, he casts out demons by the prince of demons. The Pharisees were the spiritual leaders. The scribes and the Pharisees were the ones that were stuck in the old ministry of condemnation. They would have never associated with most of the people that Jesus healed. But that's because these scribes and the Pharisees, we learned last year, these are what God calls the bad shepherds. They weren't like David, that was a good shepherd, that went to all of the sheep, healed them, bound them, and kept them safe. These scribes and Pharisees of that day, they were the priests of that day, the spiritual leaders. They didn't care about certain people. And so here they are, and when they see Jesus caring about people that they don't care about, Jesus is ushering in a new, more glorious ministry, and they don't want to have anything to do with it. And the reason Matthew keeps reminding us, the reason Matthew builds up these joyous occasions, moments of rejoicing, things that make all of us happy and feel good about what Jesus does, and Matthew always inserts the scribes and the Pharisees and says, but they didn't believe. But they didn't like what he was doing. But they said, he's a demon. And he does this because he's a demon. The reason Matthew brings that up is because Matthew is ultimately working his way to the end of this ministry of condemnation, the Mosaic law, the end of the priesthood, the end of the scribes and the Pharisees. And so throughout the gospel, those people that were bad shepherds are always the antagonist. I believe Matthew's gospel was written around 80 AD, which would have been 10 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the destruction of the priesthood, the destruction of the scribes and the Pharisees, the destruction of all the sacrifices. I believe Matthew is writing his gospel 10 years after that to remind people that what is now gone, the scribes and the Pharisees, those bad shepherds, don't return to that. Don't go back to that. In Hebrews, we remember Christians get warned about not going back to the old way. Don't go back to the old law. And I think that's what Matthew is doing. He's painting the scribes and the Pharisees in a very bad light to help remind the people, don't go back to that system because that system was a ministry of condemnation. Jesus came to bring a much more glorious ministry. I'll close with one more verse. If we go back to last week's sermon, the end of what we read last week, let me read it to you again. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 16. Jesus talks this story at the end of last week's sermon, and he talks about you don't mix the old with the new. He gives some examples of things that go wrong if you try to mix something new with something that is old and left over, and that's what he's going to talk about here. So verse 16, no one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment because the patch will tear away from the garment, and the tear will be made worse. Number 17, neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skin will burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. New wine must be put into new wineskins. If you've never really understand what Jesus is saying, he's comparing his new, more glorious ministry that has efficacy for everybody. No one is excluded from the new ministry. He's replacing the old ministry that was a ministry of exclusion and condemnation. And what Jesus is saying as a result of the works that he's doing here is he's saying, you can't mix my new ministry with the old ministry. The example is, he says, if anybody of you sew, you probably know this principle, but you don't take a brand new piece of cloth and put it on an old piece of cloth, because if you sew it, when you wash it, what's going to happen? It's going to shrink, it's going to tear, it's not going to work. That was one example. The next example was new wine in old wineskins. When you put wine in a wineskin, it ferments and the yeast are active and it bloats that old wineskin and will stretch it all the way out. But once that wineskin is stretched, it can't stretch anymore. So if you were to empty that wineskin and put brand new, fresh, new wine in there, the yeast in that new wine is going to start creating gases, and it's going to want to expand that old wineskin, and it's going to explode and break. And so I believe that's Jesus trying to teach the people that this new ministry, the new way that I am teaching you, Equality for all, no judgment, no distinguishing across the board between people of high affluent status and people of no status. No distinguishing between what's male and what's female. No distinguishing between an affluent person and a poor person. Jesus says that's the new ministry. And that's not going to work if you try to mix it together with that old ministry. I hope it's obvious, and that's why I titled the sermon, A New and More Glorious Ministry.